Hello and welcome to Landscape Photography World, the podcast for everyone passionate about landscape photography. I'm Grant Swinburne and I'll be your host on this show discussing the wonderful world of landscape photography. This time I'm talking to Colby Brown about his landscape photography journey. Colby Brown is a photographer, photo educator and author based out of eastern Pennsylvania, specialising in landscape, travel workshops and humanitarian photography. His photographic portfolio spans the four corners of the globe. Throughout his work, one can see that he combines his love of the natural world with his fascination for the world's diverse cultures. Each of his photographs tells a story of life on this planet. Colby became a photographer back in 2006, rapidly rising in the ranks of the photo industry. Not too long after picking up his first DSLR, Colby was leading photography workshops for National Geographic in South America, further spurring his love for both travel and photo education. In 2011, he founded The Giving Lens, an organisation that blends photo education with support for various NGOs and causes around the world. The Giving Lens helps fight for child education, clean drinking water projects, species preservation, women's rights and much more. I hope you enjoy the show. Hi Colby, welcome to the podcast. How are you going?
I'm doing good, Grant. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm very excited to have you on board too. It's great to talk to you. I've been watching your stuff for a little while, and it's really for me, I guess, quite an honour to have someone like you with your talent on board.
Oh, well, like I said, very excited to be here. I'm stoked to see what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah. Well, let's start. So, what's the Colby Brown story?
Well, it depends on how far we want to go back, right? Are we talking about origin for photography in general?
Well, why not? You want to start there? Let's start there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I don't have that nostalgic photography story that my father or my grandfather gave me a camera when I was little, and it's just something I've always wanted to do. Yep. I know there are photographers out there, and that's their stories, but it's not mine. I took a photography class, I think, when I was in 7th grade, but I was much more interested in football and girls at the time to really pay too much attention. And it wasn't until kind of the tail end of my high school career where I started traveling a little bit. And then when I got into university, I got bored after every, 1 or 2 years, and I go traveling. And it was just right at the time when digital photography was starting to become more affordable and more accessible, where I find myself, taking small cameras out or trying to learn more about them, trying to take better, snapshots of my trips or things like that. Yep. And that really kind of got me hooked on the idea or the possibilities, I guess, when it comes to photography. But it wasn't until after I graduated from university, where I was working in a hospital, that coincidentally, my job was a safety administrator. So what I was doing is putting together mitigation plans for things like pandemics, which was, ironic after this last year and a half we've all lived through.
How'd the plan go?
To be fair, it pretty much went to a T what we expected societies to do. We planned out for the little hospital I was working in at the time. But yeah, I learned really quickly into that job, that the whole 8 to 5, 9 to 5 thing just wasn't working for me. I needed change. I was wearing a suit and tie. I had an office, and it wasn't my thing. And so I sold everything, or most things that I had at the time. I was living in Texas, here in the US, and I moved up to Canada. I'm actually a dual citizen, so my mother's full Canadian.
Okay.
And I was in British Columbia, Vancouver area, staying with my older sister at the time. And I just kind of had this epiphany that I realized how much I loved travel with those opportunities I've had when I was in high school and throughout college. And I just wanted to get back on the road. I had no debt, or very little debt. I didn't have a family at the time. I didn't have a wife or kids or anything. And so I was kind of free to, do whatever I wanted to do. And because I wanted to be back on the road, I decided to purchase my first digital camera specifically just so that I could potentially maybe sell a few pictures or make a little money on the side just so I can keep traveling for a few years.
Right, yeah.
And that's what I did. I bought a camera. I studied for a few months around Vancouver, BC, in the woods out there. Woke up one morning and I was like, hey, I think I'm ready. Bought a one-way ticket to Bangkok over in Thailand. And then that started a 3.5 year journey of living in Southeast Asia, building up a portfolio, learning from my mistakes, trying all sorts of things, of putting myself outside my comfort zone. And at the tail end of that, I ended up finding myself getting hired by National Geographic around 2008, 2009. And that kind of really springboarded my career, where I was helping them build out some of their expedition programs for their student expedition part of their enterprise, where they're taking high school and college kids and taking them to beautiful places and teaching them about photography, but also about science and history and all sorts of other fun stuff. And that kind of just launched everything from there. But that was, that's how I dabbled and tiptoed into it.
So what was that experience like with National Geographic? Did they approach you, or were you sort of submitting an application, or how did that work?
It was definitely submitting an application. So what happened is I was in Nepal at the time. I was working on a few small projects. Back in those days, I was, writing for wherever I could, newspapers, magazines. It was kind of at the height of the .com boom for travel journalism. And so I was taking pictures and writing and whatnot. And so I was working in Nepal, as I mentioned, for about 3 months or so, living up in the Sherpa communities, working on a few things up in the Himalayas. When at the tail end of that, I was kind of like ready for a break. I'd been traveling for multiple years by this time. I decided to take a trip back here to the US, and waiting for me in one of my bunches of mail after being gone for so long was one of National Geographic's expedition programs. And so I started flipping through it and trying to figure out who are leading these groups, who are the photographers. And by that time, like I said, I'd been traveling for 3 or 4 years permanently, doing it full time. I had a good eye. I was, felt I was pretty decent with photography. And so I ended up just finding out who I needed to contact. And I sent in a resume. About a month or two later, I ended up getting an interview. I actually did it online, which was very weird for back. That was like never happened back in that time.
That would have been very strange in those days.
In the day of the Zoom now, like what we're talking on right now, obviously it's not a big deal.
Everyone's used to it. It's just the way you work now,
Absolutely. But yeah, back then it wasn't the case. And so that was kind of weird, but it was nice. I had a follow-up interview a month after that. And then I got a phone call and they said, "Hey, we'd like to send you to Belize to help us build out these programs." And I was like, "Great, that sounds awesome. Belize sounds great." And they called me like 2 weeks after that. And they're like, "Hey, we actually have this opportunity open up in Ecuador and the Galapagos." And I was like, "Sign me up."
Yeah.
And so I ended up staying in Ecuador and the Galapagos for a little over half a year, and essentially built out their programs, and had a bunch of teams come down and kind of led them, taught photography, had a bunch of kids and young adults come out through that program. And it was great. It was a lot of fun. And like
so
I said,
are you teaching local people the photography and how to lead expeditions, or are you just taking tourists around? What's the sort of program look like?
It was a little bit more on the tourist side, although like I said, there's a bit more educational. It wasn't like vocational school where we were teaching people to be leaders and whatnot. It was more so it's just like any of Nat Geo's expeditions. Like they have their adult expeditions, they have the student expeditions, which is one that I was working on. And it's the same principle. People are paying a lot of money to go onto these places for these individuals. These parents are paying for these kids to come down to learn more. It's like you'd go to Peru and you'd learn about the Mayan culture, but then you'd also have some photographers on there to teach people how to take better photos, but you're also going to have like an archaeologist. In Ecuador and the Galapagos, we had a biologist with us as well. And so like they're learning and studying about those things. It's very educational focused. But then we're also kind of doing adventure and wildlife photography. And so we're teaching them that as we go along. So it's kind of this well-rounded thing for like a 2-week trip at a time. We'd run multiple of those after a while. So I was the one that was sent in beforehand to kind of build out the logistics, put together the plans of like, what do we do? How do we get there? How do we make all this happen? And then once it was ironed out, we started bringing the teams down. And that was my first foray working for Nat Geo.
Fantastic. So you've been shooting, I guess, all over the world. What locations are still on your bucket list? Is there anywhere you haven't been?
Oh, absolutely. It's a really interesting question, because when I first started out, right, I think like most of us, the bucket list that we have is generally pretty big. Like, when you haven't traveled a lot.
My list is long.
Yeah, you want to go to a lot of different places, right? But I find that oftentimes when you're in that space and it's earlier in your career, or when you haven't traveled a lot, it's very broad objects that are listed on that list, right? It's like, I want to go to China. I want to go visit India. I want to go see something. Whereas now that I've been doing this this will be coming up on my 16th year, and I've traveled well over 100 countries, is that, my list is exponentially longer, even though I've had all these amazing travel experiences, because it's exponentially more specific, right? So instead of like, I want to go to India.
I want to go I want to go and see this particular tree next to this particular waterfall.
Absolutely, for sure. And like the cultural stuff, I want to go visit, I want to go to Mongolia at this time of the year to see this. I want to, track, I've been doing a lot more wildlife lately. So it's like, I want to go track this particular, endangered species that only is in this part of the world in this small window. And so the list gets longer, but because each of those different experiences is much more specific. And so it's very interesting. Like for me, I'd say, there's a handful of larger countries that I have really wanted to go explore more, places like Madagascar that I haven't been, even though I've traveled all over Africa. Stuff like that. There's a lot of places within like Brazil, which I go quite often to go photograph jaguars down in the Pantanal, but that's mostly in the southern part and southwestern corner near the Amazon basin compared to going to the Northeast. So there's lots of little nuances like that I still would love to go have, even including to places and countries that I have extensively traveled, but I just haven't had the opportunity to build in these other experiences or these other opportunities to capture different things. And so, I'd say places like I said, Madagascar and the lemurs is something that's big for me right now. Going out and exploring more of Greenland. I mean, I'm part Canadian. I've explored, a lot of Canada, but there's a lot of places like up near Tombstone or Baffin Island that I haven't been, stuff like that. I find myself, as I've been doing this for longer, I too am much more specific in kind of those experiences I want to have. I want to go see the iconic stuff that I haven't seen, because I think there's reason things are iconic, but I also want to travel, or I want to go have those experiences or document and capture images from places that are exponentially more difficult to get to, right? I want to go down to Patagonia, where a lot of people go, but then I want to do different hikes that other people haven't done because they're quite difficult. Or I want to go up to Alaska and go visit a very remote area in order to go photograph bears that people don't get a chance to go to. Things like that, I think helps keep it interesting from my perspective and keeps me going after so many years of doing this.
Well, I'll touch on that a little bit later about how you stay motivated. But I guess, how far do you travel each year? I mean, the last couple of years probably a lot less.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, COVID was interesting. I started off the year like any other year, right? I spent New Year's Eve in Uganda trekking with silverback gorillas with some clients, and then I went from there to Norway to photograph the Northern Lights, and then I went to Cuba, and I was actually in Cuba when like the world shut down, and that was like the end of it for the rest of the year, which was really a blessing in disguise, because I got to spend time with my family. And the reason that that's a blessing in disguise is because normally I travel anywhere between 5 to 6 months, maybe 7 months out of the year, depending on if it's a busy year and depending on where around the world I'm going to. And so, it can add up quite a bit. So last year was, a lot of people were, struggling. Obviously, there was a lot of turmoil and there's a lot of hurt. And I absolutely, understand that. For me personally, outside of, the financial, restraint or loss of income because of lack of travel, it was actually wonderful. I was really fortunate to be able to spend more time with my wife and son than I have since both me and my wife got married and since my son was born. And he just turned 10 literally last weekend. Okay. And so it was great. It was great to have that opportunity, even if it was amidst this chaos and all this other stuff that was happening. It was a wonderful silver lining, at least for me personally.
So how far have you traveled? I guess, what's the furthest you've traveled to get a shot?
Oh, I mean, I guess it's hard to quantify that because, for distance is obviously relative to where I'm at right now is probably like almost on the opposite side of the world for you. Like I've been to Australia so many times, right?
Yep.
But in terms of like the sheer remoteness of stuff, again, a lot of that these days has been coming down to wildlife photography, which has kind of been a passion for the last 5 years. So, I'd say going up to remote parts of Canada to photograph polar bears, up in the Yukon, up there in the Hudson River, or Hudson, Lake Hudson, or I'd say going down to Antarctica, South Georgia, Falkland Islands, places where you gotta, spend 2 or 3 days on a boat just to sail to these spots or get to.
Yeah.
Stuff like that, I think, are quite interesting. Places like Mongolia or Bolivia, again, can be quite challenging. It doesn't take so long to get to these locations because the infrastructure is so bad in these countries that once you get there, the transit, domestic options in order to travel or hike or to, hire a donkey and a guide in order to get to the spot you want to get to ends up elongating that transit, right? So there's lots of variables within that space. But I'd say, between the remote landscape opportunities like that, exploring different parts of the Andes and both southern and northern Patagonia to Bolivia, to the more of the wildlife stuff, which, like I said, would probably say more of Antarctica. That's been was a high on my own personal bucket list, and I was able to check that off a couple of years ago, and love going back since. And so,
how did you get down there? Did you go in through South America or through New Zealand or Australia? Because there's a couple of other different ways. I mean, if you're with the US programs, you can actually fly in there into McMurdo, for example. But
yeah, absolutely. For me, what I did, because again, most of the stuff that a decent chunk of what I do is still wrapped around education and leading trips or workshops or things like that. And so I'm always trying to do, when I'm setting up a new trip or I'm setting up a new experience, I'm often will try to plan accordingly for the eventuality of maybe bringing clients down. And so for when it came to Antarctica, I flew down into Ushuaia in Argentina and then jumped on a boat from there, took the 3-day cruise out to Falkland, spent a couple of days there, a couple-day cruise down to South Georgia, spent a few days, 5 or 6 days there, and then head down to the Antarctic Peninsula and spent time down there before crossing back over the Drake. Was my first time when I went down there. That was the option. And I liked it. I enjoyed it. I mean, I love Antarctica. It's amazing. I love the penguin colonies, but South Georgia to me is just one of the most fascinating places on the planet. I mean, it's just such a unique place that I think a lot of people don't even know exists. Like, I always try to describe it as if, think of if Hawaii or New Zealand, either or both of them maybe, had a baby with the Galapagos. Like the end up result would be the South Georgia Island, right? You have glaciers and mountains and fjords, and then penguin colonies with millions of penguins and like fur seals and like albatross. I don't know. It's such a unique spot. I could spend months down there and probably still just scratch the surface of what I want to experience.
Yeah, there's a place similar to that south of Australia called Macquarie Island. It's kind of not quite halfway between the bottom of Tasmania and Antarctica, and
awesome.
It's literally just this little speck on the map. Was, I think, volcanic in origin, but again, just absolutely covered with penguins, fur seals, and terns and albatross and all that sort of thing. They actually had a problem there though. I think it was rats or something. Some ship some years ago had sort of parked there and people had got off and rats had come off the ship and had started to sort of devastate some of the wildlife. But they've actually been running a program down there to eradicate them and bring back some of the wildlife that got knocked out of that. But
that's interesting.
Yeah, that one's definitely on my bucket list because it's kind of this really unique sort of ecosystem that's, not quite Antarctic, not quite, sub-Antarctic. It gets very cold in winter, obviously, but
sure.
I mean, actually, I think it's pretty cold all year round because of where it is. But, it gets knocked around because it's in the roaring 40s as well, so there's a lot of wind and, rain and, some really dramatic scenery there too. It is only tiny, but it's just really dramatic. But it's hard to get to. It's really hard to get to.
Well, there you go. It's like small conversations like this. We're like, now I have another option on my my bucket list of like things I want to go experience. It's difficult to get to. Sign me up. Let's do this.
Sounds good. So what motivates you to keep going? You talked about motivation. So what is it that gets you going and gets you up, other than conversations like this?
Yeah, for sure. For me, it's a couple fold, right? As I've been doing this for 16 years, I own a couple of different photography companies, the Giving Lens, a few other initiatives. And like, this is like the breadwinner. This is the bread and butter for our family, right? So first and foremost, this is what I do for a living. It happens to also be something that I love and that I'm passionate about. So I have that trifecta. But that's the driving force. When I'm looking at pricing out, projects I'm pitching to companies or marketing campaigns, or how do I come up with the numbers I come up with when it comes to, workshops or, tutorials I sell or any of that other stuff. I always calculate the time invested into it that takes me away from my family, whether that's feet on the ground or whether that's here in the studio building stuff out. And that helps me justify and keep my head on straight for like what I'm doing. My time is valuable because it's taking away from other things that I want to do, such as spending time with my family.
Sure.
Outside of that, from the personal side of it, coming back to the creative or the artistic side, I'm an individual within the photo industry that requires diversity in passion.
Yeah.
The reason that I've kind of realized this later on in my life now, I'm 39 this year, is that early on in my earlier careers when I worked in the hospital and things like that, the reason that I couldn't do the 9 to 5, that I couldn't work at that hospital as a safety administrator, was partially because of, for me personally, that monotony of consistency, right? Having to do the same things over and over again is something that it drains my soul a little bit. And so for me, early on in my career within photography, I learned that I needed to diversify my interests. And, the advice for most people out there these days, and still to this day, and there's arguably some truth to it, is like specialize, right? So get known to be this guy that or girl that photographs this, or that specializes in time-lapse photography, or does this, because it's easier to get, a name built up for yourself by doing that. And there's, like I said, there's truth to that in just business 101, not just endemic to photography. But for me, that just never worked. I couldn't be the guy that like just shot, landscape images of Yosemite National Park, as beautiful as Yosemite was. And it was just a few hours from my house growing up in California. I just could never do that. I couldn't just go to the same place and shoot the same thing. And so for me, what's kind of kept me going over the years and kept me inspired, kept my creative juices flowing, is that constant challenge of like, I started off in photography doing travel photography because that was what I wanted to do. I didn't want to get into photography. I wanted to travel, and photography was just a conduit to capture some of that. Yeah, exactly. It was a means to an end. And then from there, that kind of led into like landscape work, right? I want to be isolated into these remote places and capture the beauty and the solitude and the grandeur of Mother Nature. And then after a handful of years of doing that, I started feeling disconnected from humanity. That's why I started the Giving Lens, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, which talks about, it focuses on the philanthropic and helping thy neighbor. That type of mindset of really connecting with other human beings and making tangible differences in their lives. And then over the last few years, as I mentioned, with everything that's happening in terms of, warming of the planet, and people can argue semantics of global warming and human interaction, like we are warming. And species are leaving, right? So, they're dying, and we are eradicating, partially through human existence and partially through this warming, and partly through a lot of different things, where we're actually losing a lot more species than I think people realize. And so that idea to document and conserve nature and whatnot has really been a passion trajectory for me for the last 5 or 6 years. So having that mixture of interest, and then going from one genre to another, keeps things fresh, so that every time I leave the house to work on a project, I'm doing something different. It keeps me on my toes to make sure that I'm learning new techniques. I'm challenging myself with stepping outside my comfort zone, so that I can learn more about different types of different genres, or different, different editing techniques, like all different sorts of things that I can learn as I go along. And that kind of helps me going. A really great example of that, just really quickly, is my first trip outside after COVID, 2020, was this past May down to Costa Rica. And I was working on a wildlife video project for Sony. And being down there, I have, I've done wildlife for a number of years, like I mentioned, but I haven't done a lot of work with flash, and I haven't done a lot of work with macro. But like Costa Rica is like the place to go to photograph like poison dart frogs and pit vipers, and hang out in the jungles with creepy crawlers and really create some amazing things. And so I forced myself to learn about that stuff and how do I light and how do I do this. And it was so fun being down there in the jungles and like sweat pouring off of my face because it's so humid and you're in a rainforest in the middle of the night chasing down poisonous snakes. And then once you find them, like, how do you safely capture it? How do you do it in a way that doesn't offend the creature itself? Like, how do you do all these different things? And that was a new challenge for me. And so like the whole time I'm down there in this like environment that I think a lot of photographers be like, I would not do that. That doesn't sound comfortable at all. I'm getting bit by bugs in the jungle and all this other stuff happening. But I just had this giant smile on my face because it was a challenge and it was fun and walking away with images I'm proud of. And I can take some of that knowledge and apply it to other stuff. And further that interest as well, because I love it. Now I want to go back down to Costa Rica and go to more remote parts of Costa Rica and document some more, lesser known amphibians and reptiles in the same manner. So lots of little stuff like that helps keeping me, moving forward and helps keeping me challenging myself and improving my game at the same time. Yeah.
You mentioned, some of these projects take you away from your family. Do you ever bring them along? And how does that work? Because you're obviously doing this for a living, you're doing this for work. Particularly when you're traveling to, some nice place where there's a nice resort and whatever, it must be tempting to sort of not do too much photography and sit by the pool for a while. How do you balance that?
It's a good question. My son has been on airplanes since, a few months after he was born, but most of that stuff when he was younger was regulated to our family traveling around the US, going to different places. But now that he's older, in the last couple of years, he's really kind of expanded his interests. He's expanded his passions. He's becoming his own little person, obviously, with his own, own ideas of what he wants to do and what interests him. And so we've worked that in. And so nowadays, oftentimes, again, outside of COVID, it's like, hey, I'm going to here. I'm going to the British Virgin Islands, or I'm going to Iceland. I'm going to Alaska. And I have to work on these projects. Maybe at the tail end of those projects, I'm going to get my wife and son to fly out. And that's what we just did actually in Iceland. This is the second time my wife and son has been there, but I was just there, taught my first workshop teaching since COVID, hit. So I taught a full workshop in Iceland this summer. And then I worked on a couple projects, one for Dell and one for Western Digital. And then at the tail end for the last 8 days, I ended up spending about a month out there this summer. Wife and son came out. We rented a camper van. We hung out. I showed them some of my favorite places that they hadn't seen before, and they got a chance to experience that. So like I said, we've done that in a couple of different locations, and we're going to continue to do that to both broaden my son's horizon and to also, as you said, to get my family to be together in some pretty amazing locations around the world and kind of piggyback off the efforts that I'm already doing from a business sense, where I'm already in these destinations, and have them come out and experience them for themselves once I've wrapped up all the actual work. And then I can just focus on being a dad and a husband and hanging out and having a good time and showing them some places that I love.
Nice. So has he shown any interest in photography, or is it just, that's just dad's thing, I don't do that?
He has, absolutely.
My girls are all grown up, so they're I think the youngest 23. She turned 23 the other week. So they go through that phase of anything parent related is not for me. So where is he on that spectrum at the moment?
Well, at 10, we're still in the early days, right?
Yeah, so, you haven't quite nudged that teen rebellious.
We haven't jumped into that just yet. I know it's coming at some point for sure. But for Jack, which is his name, nice Australian name. He's a unique individual that he has interest in photography or video work or different things like that. But his attention span at this time is like, it's not enough to really know if there's going to be any trajectory, right? Is there going to be anything behind that? But he does have his own camera. When we go traveling, he takes his own pictures and things like that. And takes his own videos and enjoys that stuff. But he doesn't really do too much of it after that besides show his friends, which is perfect at this age. That's what it should be. But we'll see. Right. Who knows, right? We don't try to push him into anything. We try to provide as many opportunities and then see what he does, right? And so it's been interesting seeing him grow. But it's pretty adorable, especially when he was little. 5 years old, walking around with this little camera, taking pictures of nature is just warms my heart for sure.
Fantastic. So what, you mentioned the giving lens. Can you tell us how that got started and what its aims are, what it's all about?
Yeah, absolutely. So the giving lens, is the short 45-second elevator pitch, is essentially, it's an organization that blends the idea of, combining people's love and passion for photography and the arts with support for sustainable development initiatives, charities, organizations that are fighting for various causes around the world. And typically, we are partnering with these organizations that are working in the developing world, that are championing these different causes. As I said, we do a lot of work with youth education programs, but we also do stuff with women's vocational schools. We've worked with Syrian refugees in the Middle East. We've worked with families from the migrant trains coming out of Central and South America, coming up here to the U.S. border. We've done all sorts of stuff all over the world. And so essentially what we do is we take teams of photographers. People sign up to come on these trips. They pay a fee, kind of similar to a workshop where we're teaching people how to be better photographers. But for the flip side is that we're partnering with these organizations, and we're figuring out ways in order to tangibly give back to these communities that we're working in. Sometimes that's documenting a project. Sometimes it's bringing donated camera gear and teaching these organizations how to better document and advocate for the projects that they're working on so that they can raise money. All sorts of things. Every trip is different and unique. And then at the tail end of it, we make a sizable donation based on those proceeds that have come in back to those same people that we were working with on the ground, so that they help with their own fundraising and they can, again, expand the projects and the work that they're doing. And so it's a multifaceted element that has kind of grown and morphed over the years. But the reason that I started it was because those early years when I started traveling around the world, I was noticing there was a handful of discrepancies when it came to just travel in general, tourism, and certainly travel photography that never set right for me. One of those was just the dehumanizing nature of travel photography, or tourism really in general. It's like oftentimes it's these Westerners going to these countries, generally poorer countries, at least the ones that I was going to. And we have these cameras and we stick cameras in people's faces and we feel we're entitled to take these shots. We don't ask for permission. It's a very one-sided and dehumanizing experience for a lot of people around the world. And that never really set right with me. I wanted to, break down the fabric of why that's happening and how can we correct that. And then on top of that, I also wanted to have a better understanding of where the money that we spend when we travel really goes. Because oftentimes, again, in the developing world, hotel chains or restaurants, even a lot of these places,
multinationals rather than to the local people.
Exactly.
The local people get a few pennies, but everyone else is making big coin.
They're making the money. Exactly. You're 100% right. Whether it's Canadian, US, European, Australian, owned, all these different facets, like you never really know. And so we wanted to break that down. We wanted to make sure we know where that stuff's going. And ultimately, like I said, we wanted to make the experience a more of a two-way street. We wanted to make it a benefit for these, individuals in these communities to let us into their world, to show us the realities of what their challenges are that they face, to pull out the curtain and to show us the real world, take the filters off, so to speak, and to have a unique experience in a way that is wrapped around art and photography and learning about that, but also helping out these individuals and helping out these communities in a way that isn't the standard humanitarian approach of, Western people coming in and telling people how to solve their problems, but more so working together and working with these organizations and these communities. Like, how can we help you? How can we help you raise money? How can we, what are your needs and where can we help you achieve those goals? And it's been very successful in doing that. We've raised lots of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars. We've, bring tons of donated camera gear from all over the world to different places where we've helped build photography programs in places like Nicaragua with an organization called Empowerment International that essentially uses their photography and their biking program, separate program, to give incentive for kids to stay in school and keep the retention rates high, so that the organization is helping keep kids out of gangs and helping them stop, dropping out of school, and the benefit out of them staying in school and having those attendance, positive attendance records, and taking advantage of this organizational educational tools to help them through that process, that they have the added benefit of learning photography, or having bike races and mountain bike races and all this other stuff that they wouldn't have the opportunity to have otherwise. And through programs like that, they've been able to keep retention rates in the high 90s with the kids that they work in the barrios outside of Grenada, which is just outstanding for anyone that understands youth education programs somewhere around the world. Like, that's unheard of. And so, like, little things like that really help create sustainable relationships with these communities, and allows us to, like I said, play a tangible role in making a difference in the lives of what's happening. And we get the benefit of showing that to these clients that we bring down with us to, help open up and broaden their horizons and see, like I said, a bit more of how the real world works out there.
Fantastic. So how do people get involved? How do people donate? Where do they go? What do they need to do?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the best place to go is thegivinglens.com. So much obviously with travel and everything that's been happening, like a lot of our social media and a lot of other things have been kind of put on hold because of COVID. But, going into 2020, we are hitting the ground running, hopefully Delta variant, and other things aside. We'll keep an eye on everything that's going, but that's our goal, is to continue to push out for 2020 and have lots of great projects around the world to get back into helping these communities, because a lot of people aren't realizing that, yes, it's unfortunate for people here in the US and for you guys in Australia and a lot of other Western places, but a lot of these countries, a lot of these communities, their income went down to zero when tourism stopped, right? Yeah. And so how do we jumpstart that in a safe way for a lot of these countries that can't get the vaccine yet, right? Or they won't be getting them for a while. That's what we're trying to navigate right now. But right now, long-winded answer to your question, go to thegivinglens.com, sign up for our newsletter. There's a little donate button there if you want to give back. We're also going to be working on some new initiatives that are coming out at the tail end of this year, like I said, to get ready for 2022. Anything like that. And you can just search up The Giving Lens, or just go to thegivinglens.com, or shoot me an email and I'll happily point you in the right direction.
Fantastic. Thanks. Yeah, it's something that I think a lot of people haven't been talking about very much, as you were saying, that impact of the lack of travel over the last year and a half or so, and what impact that's had on economies, like Fiji or Vanuatu, here in the South Pacific, just to name a few. And I know it's not just there; there's plenty of other places that their economies have just sort of dropped through the floor because the Western population and other areas aren't traveling as much as they did.
100% true. I was getting, messages, I do use WhatsApp. I'm sure a lot of people do the travel. All my guides, all the fixers, all the people I work with all over Africa, we're just reaching out and friends, people that I've known for years, and they're just like, we have nothing overnight. Like, it stopped.
Yeah, it's just dropped off a cliff. Yeah.
And people aren't necessarily, obviously everyone needs to make choices that are based on, you being safe and whatnot. I 100% get that. But the conversation, as you said, hasn't been happening. It's like these communities are starving, and they don't have their governments that are helping them out, right? And so it's going to be interesting what happens in 2022 to see how that can be rekindled. I'm already working on a handful of projects in places across Africa to hopefully help jumpstart some of that on a small scale. But it's very important stuff that I think, like I said, a lot of us that have the privilege of being in these places that have helpful safety nets that they don't have in a lot of places around the world.
Yeah. So has the pandemic changed your attitude towards traveling and photography?
That's a good question. I think, like a lot of events in my life, it helps bring perspective, right? I think it helps. For me, again, coming back to the silver lining from last year, spending so much time with the family, it's like realizing how much I missed when I was gone, building up my brands and my companies. There are times that I can't get back, right? I've been fortunate to be very successful, or have found quite a bit of success in the photo industry, so I can't complain by any stretch of the imagination. But that really opened my eyes, and having that much time to be able to spend at home with no trips for, well over a year, and to enjoy that helped me prioritize projects I want to work on, It helps me think more proactively, as we were just talking about the money that I spend and the value that that has to a lot of communities and on places, especially that I travel to, because I don't travel around Europe all that much. I do come to Australia, but a lot of the work I do is Africa, South America, Southeast Asia. And, seeing that, how that changed really opened up my eyes to the realities again, further evidence of these challenges that a lot of these places, deal with, that have a gross domestic product that wraps around tourism.
When it's the core of your economy, it really makes a difference.
Absolutely. Whether it's a national disaster or something like a pandemic, like these things can just have devastating impacts. And so a lot of those things just helps me appreciate the time I have at home, helps me want to spend more time with the family. And like I said, helps me prioritize where I want to go, what projects I want to work on, what stories I think are important. And just how I want to prioritize that time and investment moving forward, because after 16 years and having traveled to all 7 different continents, and again, having the luxury of having successful businesses, I get to pick and choose where I go now. It wasn't like early on my career where you got to say yes to everything and you're doing work you don't want to do. Like, I have that luxury now. So I think I need to not take it for granted. I need to make sure that the choices I make are very pointed and very focused and intentional. And that's kind of my plan moving forward, is to learn from this time and to, value that time away from my family, and also to include them in more stuff. Make sure that I'm helping as many communities as I can out there, as I'm working on other projects that are also important to me, whether it's from a business or financial standpoint as well.
Sure. Are there any particular photographers, I guess, that are out there that are really inspiring you at the moment?
Yeah, again, the benefit of having this really wide interest, interest in a variety of genres in photography, really kind of keeps me, keeps my ear to the ground for a lot of different people that are doing stuff out there. A lot of photographers that are up and comers, a lot of people that have seasoned professionals have been doing this for a long time. People like Paul Nicklin and Christina Mittermeier, fellow Sony ambassadors here with me, that do a lot of work with Sea Legacy and Nat Geo. I always find their work inspiring. Andrew Studer is a young photographer here in the US that constantly amazes me, or Michael Shainbloom, handful of photographers that are doing they're really stepping up their creative game and pushing boundaries that I think a lot of people didn't think about what they're doing. And then people like doing stuff that is completely outside my wheelhouse. Drew Dracey is another Sony artisan that does time-lapse work. He did the intro to House of Cards, if you've ever seen it, does a lot of work with the NFL and things like that. But like, his whole world is time-lapse and cinematography. And like, that's way outside the realm of stuff that I normally do. So I like finding people like Drew, or a lot of these other individuals I mentioned, and plenty of other people out there that are doing things that I may not necessarily want to get into, but I'm inspired by their creativity. That inspires me to want to, be more creative myself, to try new things, step outside my comfort zone, to travel to different places, or to try new techniques, and to continue to constantly learn. Like, I think the moment I feel that I don't have anything else to learn, like I need to sell my cameras and try something new, because I think that's the fun part. Like, I love that journey. I love constantly trying to better myself. And I don't know. I love that whole aspect of it.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely with you on that. The amount of inspiration I've got from looking at things that, as you say, aren't in my wheelhouse. My natural home is sort of knee deep in water somewhere, either at a waterfall or taking a sunrise shot with some waves and whatever. But the people that inspire me are the ones that are actually using light really uniquely, and whether it's landscape, whether it's portrait, or even digital art. Some of the digital artists that are doing things now, whether it's moving or a still image, is just phenomenal when you take a look at how they've actually used light effectively to convey either a message or a story. And for me, that's really what it's all about. And they're the things that get my creative juices going, is looking at that and going, okay, how can I use some of that? I'm never going to be a portrait photographer, but how can I use some of that and take that back into my own work and really utilize what I'm learning out of that.
It's a great approach for it, man. I mean, that, I oftentimes what I do, with like things like platforms like Instagram, right, is that I'm constantly looking at, different hashtags and different things to see what I can find outside my sphere of influence, right? Like I've been fortunate. I have 258,000 followers on Instagram, which has been helpful over the years with workshops or marketing campaigns and stuff. But at the end of the day, I use it to socially interact with other people. And so when I can go through and look and find out some amazing stuff that other people are doing, people that are just starting out, people that are just building their careers or trying to build a name for themselves that no one has really heard about. I love finding that stuff too. In that same vein, like for me, it doesn't have to be a professional photographer that has spent the same amount of time as I have, or their brand's on the same stature as mine. I just love seeing amazing art, and how can I learn from that? And oftentimes I will reach out to those people and say, hey, my name's Colby Brown. I love what you're doing. Like, how did you do this? Or, asking questions of things that I find interesting, in the same way that you were just mentioning, of like, oh, whether it's lighting or whether it's a certain type of technique or whether it's, compositing images or like whatever it is. Like, I don't know. I love the fact that art, and it's not endemic to photography, spurs this idea of collaborative learning. Like it doesn't always have to be a teacher to a pupil relationship. We can all learn from each other in different ways. Yeah. And I just love that. It's a fascinating aspect of this art form.
Yeah, totally. When you talk about that, where do you stand on things like, composites and using digital trickery, for want of a better term, in enhancing a photo? You might have stood there and you might have taken that photo, but you might be tempted to, I'll put a bit of glow here, or I'll add a radial filter here, or radial gradient or reflected gradient or something in there to jazz it up a bit. And I mean, people obviously do that, and some of these tricks are darkroom tricks from way back in the old
Ansel Adams days, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's a famous Australian photographer, Frank Hurley, and he was a photographer that went through World War One as a official photographer as part of the Australian Army, that went over into started off, I think, taking photos with what was called the AIF, the Australian Infantry Force, and started off taking photos of them in and around Egypt, where they were first based, before they then went into Gallipoli and then on the Western Front. And some of his images are very, very, they're some of those iconic Western Front images of the shattered trees and the mud and so forth. But he was criticized at the time because he used composites. He did that a lot, and he did that to tell the story. Here's a battle scene, for example, with a plane flying overhead that pardon me, wasn't part of the original shot of the ground and what was going on there, and that explosion might have come from another shot, that he's composited in. And at the time, he got a lot of criticism for doing things like that, because people said it's not photography. Where do you stand in all of that argument? Because there's the purists, on one side, and there's the digital artists, if you like, on the other side, and there's that big gulf in between. Where are you, in the gulf or at either end?
I feel I'm very tolerant to, artistic expression. I mean, I think just even the fact of, telling that story, and the fact that these arguments were being had back in, early in the 20th century, and we're still having them today, says a lot about the challenges of just art and understanding the variable or the fact that we all see it subjectively, right? I personally, with my work that I do, tend to refrain from compositing images. I tend to not replace skies. I've been dabbled here and there just for interests and whatnot.
You got to give it a go to see what it looks like.
Yeah, I mean, there'll be times when I'm like shooting a scene, like I don't like stack tons of images or something like that, but like I'll be shooting like Northern Lights, right, over a mountain, and then like 45 minutes later, the Northern Lights are so much better, but the foreground is better than that first shot, and I'm like, oh well, I'm gonna take that sky and come over. I've done some of those things, but a lot of the big digital artistry stuff, like that's not my cup of tea. I'm not the individual that likes to sit here in my studio and spend 5 hours working on a single image. Like that's not my happy place. I enjoy the post-processing side, but that's not where I want to be. That's not how I want to utilize that stuff. But for people that do, I think it's great. I think it's it opens up all sorts of creative doors of what you can do. I think the biggest challenge that it comes down to is just being honest when it's being done and letting people know, because I think that to me is, at least in 2021, right, the year that we are now already, that the problem is not that there's digital composites or that people are changing skies or using, adjusting their aperture or changing the lenses they're using to make a mountain look bigger or any of those other things. It's the fact that people get caught doing it because they weren't mentioning it. Yeah, exactly. From the beginning, like this is a composite image that I created and to tell this story or whatever the reason is. You can look in the same vein of the story you just told about World War I. Look at Steve McCurry, right? And like all the heat that he's been getting for the last few years, the iconic Afghan girl, like that was his iconic shot. But like a lot of his other stuff that he's developed over the years, you see the negatives that have come out, and like the actual film negatives that have been seen now, showing how a lot of those scenes were manipulated, even if sometimes they're small manipulations, where people were considering that journalism at the time. And so that is why he's getting flack now. He wouldn't get flack if he mentioned it back then, that, hey, some of these images are altered or edited.
I've enhanced some of these things.
Yeah, exactly. Little stuff like that, I think, goes a long way. So I think people should absolutely, enjoy creativity and create unique things that you think that inspires you, or that maybe more resembles what the human eye sees. Like that's another thing. A lot of people don't realize that the human eye is vastly different than the cameras and sensors and lenses that we use. Maybe they're trying to recreate that, like whatever the reason is. I think it's great that they're doing it. I think the techniques that they use, I think there's a lot of stuff that they're doing that I'm interested in learning more about, not because I want to replicate, but because I want to maybe see what, how do they handle frequency separation, or how do they use luminosity masks that I can then maybe apply to what I'm doing. But I think that when they share those, they should just let people know, because I think there's a lot of expectations for images in general. And if, you're not honest about it, and someone catches you being not honest about it, it creates a problem. But if you mention it from the beginning, there's no problem. So who cares? And no one should care that it's composite. Yeah. So that's kind of where I lie. Like, just be honest about it.
Yeah. There's a really good, photographer / composite artist, call her what you will, Kath Simard. I don't know if you've ever seen some of her.
I know Kath. Yeah, I know her. Yep.
And, absolutely stunning images, but she's very upfront. This is a composite.
Super upfront.
She I really admire that honesty, and you see a lot of people that clearly I'm pretty sure you added those birds in or whatever it is.
Oh yeah. Hey, we've been out long enough to know exactly when you're not going to get that perfect formation or those things hitting the right at the right time. The chances are infinitesimal.
I've seen that sky somewhere before.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, that's interesting right now. I mean, look what's happening with AI technology and Adobe, Sense 8 and, Skyloom, Luminar AI with what they're doing with sky replacements. And like they have these stock sets of skies that you can use to replace your stuff with. And I think you'll start seeing some of that stuff. Like I said, again, there's nothing necessarily wrong with it. I think it takes a bit more of the uniqueness out, especially if you're using some of the stock images out of Luminar or some of those things. But it's interesting because for me, I feel that creatives in general, whether it's photography or not, culinary, could be musician wise or anything like that, typically have 3 different phases of being creative, right? Or getting into the field. The first one, as we've talked about already, we just haven't mentioned it, is called mimicry. That's like where you see something that you like, That's how I got into photography.
How to do that, so you learn how to do that.
Exactly. You want to copy it, right? You want to sit there and replicate whatever it is because it inspired you to begin with. That's how most of us got into photography. And then the second phase is kind of experimentation. That's where you're starting to realize that the things that you've been copying, while they're nice, you don't necessarily feel like they're yours. So you begin trying new things, whether it's different genres or techniques, and you're trying to figure out what is your own recipe. And then the third and final stage, where most people try to attain to and not too many people get to, is like that fulfillment of creative vision. So where you get to the field and you instantly or instinctively have an idea of how you want to photograph something with an idea of how you're going to process it. And those two things merge together rather than being separate like it is for a lot of creatives out there. Yeah. And like going through those different phases where a lot of these people are. And I think right now camera gear is more affordable, processing images is more accessible, and like all these things are coming together where you're getting a lot of people attempting to skip some of those steps to create, great stuff for social media, for things like Instagram, to be insta famous, not realizing that doesn't act, I don't make a penny because an image gets, 10,000 likes on Instagram. I make it because I have the business contacts, and then I can then understand how to create value out of something like that, but not just because I'm creating something and it gets a bunch of interaction on social media, where I think a lot of aspiring artists that are into that mindset don't fully understand just yet.
Yeah. And I think, it's probably one of the worst aspects. I won't say it's the worst, but it's one of the worst aspects of social media. It's not so much the chasing of the likes per se, but it's that being the end rather than a means to something else, And so if the end is I'm getting a lot of likes or I'm getting a lot of followers, then it's kind of like, okay, where's the meaning behind it? And, what is it that you're actually going to get out of it?
Sure. Well, I think it's,
excuse me.
No, you're good. I think it's also kind of endemic of societal issues in general, not to get too existential, but like this idea of chasing external validation to make us feel better about the choices that we make. From a photographer's perspective, I see a lot of that on social media. It's like someone gets bummed because an image didn't get a lot of likes, and whether, maybe they're chasing likes, from a conscious level, but subconsciously, it's like they're valuing their work based on how other people interact with it, which I think is just a bit absurd. Like, we need to learn to appreciate the journey and the process of what we're trying to achieve, and to try to learn how to fulfill that vision. And early in our careers, early in our pathways, people don't have to be doing this for a living. It takes time and it takes process to fulfill that vision, to understand what I like to shoot and how I like to shoot it and how I like to use light and mood and atmosphere and all these different things, rather than just trying to create these shortcuts and then push it out there with expecting other people to give us adulation. And then when we don't get it, feel that we're a failure. I think it's just creating, lots of issues, mental health issues, to put it bluntly, of people constantly looking to other people to say, hey, am I doing this right? Or, hey, is this good? Rather than being like, this is good, I'm proud of it, it could be better, but I'm doing this for me, not because someone else wants it. And I think it's a hard dichotomy, right? And social media,
absolutely. And I think
it's not made it easy.
It's interesting. It seems to be, and social media is a big part of this, I think, but it's that instantaneous gratification that is part of the problem. And if I don't get that immediate response today or in the next hour, and unfortunately the algorithms are driven largely around that first hour. And it really does, as you say, sometimes, even create mental problems for people, and, for me, if you're not doing it for yourself, I'd be very tempted to stop, and the only reason I do what I do is for my own enjoyment. I mean, I print a lot of books and I print a lot of stuff that I hang on my own wall. I don't do it to sell it. I don't do it, and I never ever started doing that. It was literally all about my own enjoyment and my family's enjoyment as well.
Sure. Well, it's art in general to me is meant, and maybe again, art is subjective, but like for me personally, it's meant to be this therapeutic experience. It's meant to be a reflection of how I perceive the world, or how I experience something, how can I give justification to an experience, a feeling, an emotion, a subject, a story I want to tell. And that to me is the driving force and the purpose. And so I think sometimes we lose sight of that. And I think whether it's the instant gratification, as you mentioned, which I 100% agree, or it's just social media in general that is always the superficial, coding on the outside of what it took to actually get it, whether people are compositing or not, like we just talked about, or like some of my images where you don't see the behind the scenes where I was crawling through fields of ticks to photograph puffins in Iceland, or getting malaria in East Africa, trying to get to a specific spot. And so there's this disconnect from reality to fantasy.
You're always watching someone else's highlight reel, not the blooper reel, but
exactly.
You're living your blooper reel.
Exactly. And so it becomes very easy to judge and
right.
to jealousy towards other people, judge yourself. And I think sometimes with people with, that don't have, a certain level of confidence in their own individual self, let alone in their artistic, ability just yet, I think it breeds the potential for a lot of those more nefarious, emotions and whatnot. And, I always try to recommend people to learn to compartmentalize early. Like I personally, and this is, maybe I'm partly robotic or whatnot, but I've always understood this from the beginning, is like I've always been able to kind of separate my personal connection towards my own images with them going out into the world, whether people appreciate them or not, whether I sell, when I sell them to clients or whatnot. Like you guys can't see around here too much, but here in my office, outside of a few desktop screensavers here, I don't have any artwork in my office. None of my own images are in here. I love photographing and taking these experiences to capture those moments and share them with others, but I don't necessarily have that additional personal attachment that I think some people can, causes them to lead to a lot of these conversations these topics we were just talking about. And so I don't know, it's very interesting conversation that I think needs to happen more, especially for emerging photographers, so they hopefully realize what they're doing and can free themselves from those confines of needing that external validation or instant gratification in order to feel worth. Because, art in general is meant to be experienced, and it's part of a journey and a process that we all go through. And whether it's you or myself, like I took tons of crap images when I first started out. I still take bad images when things don't work out for my creative vision. Like we all are on this journey, and we should all appreciate the journey rather than, look for shortcuts all the time.
I've got old school photo albums of really bad images.
Touche, man. Me too.
So I guess when you're in location, what are you looking for, and how do you nail that unique perspective? Because everyone's trying to get their own take, even if they're at one of the iconic locations. I'm quite sure you've probably, if you've been to Sydney, you've taken the Opera House and the Sydney Harbour Bridge and whatever. But what are you looking for to try and nail that unique perspective?
Yeah, I think, for me, oftentimes when I'm going to a new location, I'm going to do my due diligence and my research, right? Like I'm going to look to see, what has been taken before, what are some of the iconic stuff, do my research on, weather, time of year, all sorts of other different variables. And the reason I do that is so that I can kind of come to a location with an idea of what others have tried, and then I can adjust in real time based on where the lighting is best, what leading lines are working for me, what different variables are there that you can't account for. And that helps me kind of figure out the right pathway to start. I have this kind of like 5-step program, this 5-step process workflow that I teach in my workshops. And it's something that I do myself more subconsciously now because I've taken way too many images over the years. But it really helps me work through the scene. And really quickly, it's, step number 1 is like identify your subject, right? So like, what is your subject? What is the reason that I'm wanting to take this image to begin with? And I think a lot of photographers don't really define that out. It's like, it's a pretty sunset over the, Sydney Harbour Bridge. Like that's not enough. Like, is it the light reflecting off of the water? Is it, the texture happening off of, a rock face? Like, what is it actually that is causing your eye to want to capture this to begin with? And then that origin point, that initial concept should dictate all the other choices you make out there in the field. And so from that initial point, I then go to, okay, well, what's a composition that emphasizes this choice of subject? Is my subject, again, these ripples in the water flowing over this waterfall, the green lush, canopy around it? That helps me determine what is the composition. Is it going to be vertical, horizontal? What do I include? What do I remove? That helps emphasize that initial choice of who's that hero of that story I'm trying to tell. And then from there, I go into exposure. So what is my exposure? What is the atmosphere and lighting I'm going for? I typically shoot in manual mode, so I can control all the different facets of light, capturing the right spectrums I'm going for. So I'm trying to figure out, this is my subject. This is the composition I think is most unique. Now, how do I capture the light here to emphasize that choice of composition, to emphasize that choice of subject that works in a way that, is depth of field my priority, or is motion? Am I capturing slow moving water, fast moving water, subjects in motion? Do I need depth of field? Do I not? And like that little choice helps me, is dictated from those initial choices as well. And then the fourth step is to essentially remove distracting elements, and fifth step is to take the shot. And so that's kind of the step-by-step process that I go through in my head when I'm working a scene where I'm seeing something. I'm like, okay, I instinctively know after doing this for 16 years almost now, that I'm going to start off with this lens. I have, 3 or 4 different compositional ideas in my head because this is the thing that's causing me to go to this spot. And then I organically work the scene through that workflow process of trying to play and experiment with exposure and light and tension and atmosphere and mood, kind of bring all those different pieces together and try to keep it as organic and focused on that subject as possible. Because, coming back to Instagram, I've gone through and looked at people's portfolios or on their website, wherever it is. And I see it more so on Instagram these days, but it's like every single image is like the same color tonality because they're doing it, for the gram, right?
Yeah. They're going for the grid look rather than each
exactly
piece.
They need to have them be connected, and that just doesn't work for me because I'm trying to capture images focused on the subject. And so that if you look through my stream, like it's a variety of different genres, but also I'm playing with exposure and contrast and lighting and saturation and hues differently depending on that subject. And so that's the driving force behind figuring out what is the best way to capture this unique moment or experience or feeling based on those choices and that lineage, that workflow process that helps me work a scene. And like I said, it doesn't always work out, but it starts me on the right path. And sometimes I nailed it on the first, couple of shots. Sometimes I'm trying those first few images in that workflow process, and I realize, quickly into it that this isn't working. But now all of a sudden it opened up this other opportunity, this other, change of perspective. Do I need to send a drone up and get really high and look down? Do I need to, get really low? Do I need to change lenses? But it started the organic process to work the scene more natively when I'm actually there in the field.
So do you have a favorite spot out of all the places you've been?
That's tough.
That's why I'm asking that question.
Yeah, that's a good one too. I mean, for me, again, shooting a wide variety of genres, that the answer to that question really varies depending on where my mental state is at the time. Like, where's that interest, right? When I plan trips in a normal year, I'm usually planning out anywhere between 6 months to 2 years in advance. And I'm usually predicating those based on where I'm, feeling, emotionally at the time, in terms of like, am I disconnected from humanity? Do I need to work in more humanitarian projects? Do I want to feel more connected and I feel there, more effort needs to be applied to, wildlife and conservation? Do I want to be more away from society and go spend time in a remote part of the world? All those kind of dictate where those, how I create my schedule based on that. And so, long-winded answer to your question, like when I get asked that question, it's like, where's my head at right now? Like for me, if I was, in the wildlife, headspace, I would probably say like maybe, East Africa, Uganda, silverback gorillas, maybe Brazil and the panthenol, maybe India and tigers, which is something I haven't done yet, but it's been on my list. Whether it's, more remote and, landscape and Mother Nature focused, I'd say it's hard for me to beat, places in Patagonia. Hopefully next month, assuming travel allows for it, I will be taking a group of photographers to Italy and the Dolomites. to go photograph there out in a remote, place away from cities and whatnot to be safe. But, the wonderful part of the Alps, like I love mountains. Those are kind of my happy place for solitude. Or if I feel more connected, wanted to be connected to humanity, I love visiting places like India or Papua New Guinea, close to Australia, that are just fascinating, diverse cultures and ideologies and beliefs and languages and all sorts of fun stuff. So yeah, it's a kind of all across the board, depending on where my head is at the moment.
Cool. So we've talked a little bit about highlight reels. What about some of the low light reels or the bloopers? Do you have any horror stories from your career?
Oh, goodness, sure. Yeah. I mean, I look back and there's certainly a number of times, especially from like the business side of things, where I made, grave mistakes early on in my career, said things I shouldn't have said to clients, stuff like that, I don't necessarily love rehashing. I like to think about myself, so I'd never repeat those mistakes. But just, I learned, it's interesting because, 16 years ago in 2000 or 15 years ago, 2006 is when I started, 2006 is when I started my first photography company. And there was no, there was internet, but there was no social media. Facebook had just launched for colleges and universities, but it wasn't like, we don't have the photography community we have now. So I learned a lot of the lessons, not by asking other professional photographers that I were aspiring to become, because I didn't know anyone. So I just went through the process of making those mistakes myself.
Networking and connecting was almost impossible unless you bumped into them on a shoot. Yeah.
Absolutely. And then, making mistakes and, burning bridges accidentally and learning from those mistakes. I mean, I did a lot of that different stuff. But more so from the photography and creative side. Yeah. I mean, I've had plenty of times where I've had trips that just, completely failed in terms of my expectations of what I was wanting to get out of it, or I made large, monetary investments to come away with images that never aspired. I remember the first time I went to Canada and to photograph polar bears at the Lake Hudson up there in Manitoba, or north of Manitoba in Canada, and like spend all this money, and you get out there and we've had years of the glaciers receding, and you have winter taking longer and longer, and this was one of the rare years in between a cycle which happens every 4 or 5 years, where all of a sudden the ice drastically increases a year because you get early freezes. And so I spent all this money to get up to this part to photograph polar bears the first time I go up there, and then you get up there and there's no polar bears because the ice is already frozen. So they're out hunting for harp seals, which is great for the polar bears, really bad for photography of polar bears because there's none around. And so I got plenty of stories about that.
All the action's underwater, if anyway.
Exactly. And way out on the ice, right? And it just didn't, you got to make do with the best of what what comes out of a trip like that, which is very little content, but amazing experiences to be in a remote part of the world. But you just gotta you can't control weather, you can't control especially wildlife, and so you just gotta roll with the punches. But
absolutely.
I mean, but I think of other fun ones. I remember one time in Himalayas, the first time I went out to the Himalayas and Mount Everest, I was hiking along a lot of the passes between the different valleys out there, and I got lost on a trail. I was very naive and young, and didn't feel I needed a guide, and got lost on the Khumbu Glacier crossing over to Luboshe from a place called Chukungri, which is another peak you can climb, and just like hiking for like 18 hours, not realizing where I'm at or like how dangerous it was, hiking by moonlight because I lost the goat trail crossing over a high pass, like things like that, like are great to laugh about now, but like now that I have a wife and a son and like whatnot, like I try to avoid making.
I could have died.
I could have totally died, and I try not to make those stupid mistakes anymore, or at least minimize the amount of times I find myself in situations like that where I was a little more cavalier when I was younger.
Yeah. If you weren't a photographer, what would you be?
Ooh, I don't know. Yeah. That's a great question. I would probably end up doing something in environmental science, conservation efforts.
Sure.
I just have a love of nature and being out there, in the, out there in the world and in solitude. I don't know. I could, maybe I could be like a ranger that, works in one of those fire towers out in the middle of nowhere, assuming I didn't have a family either, like if I was a complete nomad, like that would be like a happy place. I'd be like surrounded by nature, disconnected from everything. But if that wasn't the case and I had my wife and son, which I absolutely adore, Then yeah, I'd probably say something in terms of environmental science, or something along the ways of
Nice.
trying to find ways to, claw humanity out of the mess that we're creating in the world these days.
Yeah, okay. Are there any photographers that you think I should be talking to on the podcast? Anyone that's sort of interesting to talk to, or you think's got some unique perspectives that we should be exploring?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, any of the names that I mentioned before, I think are highly worthwhile. Drew Dracey, Christina Mittermeier, Paul Nicklin, Michael Shaneblum, Andrew Studer. I'm trying to think of some other ones that I know offhand. I mean, there's plenty of great ones out there that are doing exceptional work. Peter Coxon, um, Sean Bagshaw in the Pacific Northwest for landscape work.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty healthy mix of people that I think could contribute to kind of interesting topics that are happening around the world these days. Kath Smithgard, you should have
Yep.
her on. I don't know if she's been on with you yet, but
no, not yet. I've reached out to her, but haven't got a response from her. So if you're talking to her, give her a nudge.
Sure, absolutely. No, for 100%. Yeah, she'd be a great person to talk to, especially with everything happening right now. Like, I think really interesting topics that are happening in these days with stuff that she's doing is also like NFTs and cryptocurrency and things like that are very fascinating topics of stuff that's happening like at the forefront right now of innovation.
Yeah, I mean that's a fascinating experience with what's going on there with all these discussions on Clubhouse and Discord and in Twitter Spaces now. It's just a real buzz to have a look at it. I don't think photography as a genre has ever had an experience like it in its history, where you've got just so many creative people getting their heads together and talking about what they're doing and how they're doing it, and there's a lot of people presumably making a lot of money out of it, but yeah, I'm looking at it, kind of dabbling, but I haven't dived head first yet, but yeah, it's an interesting experience. The other, I guess then there's the other side of that, which is the darker side of NFTs and cryptocurrencies and so forth, which is the environmental impact, which
carbon footprint and
it puts a lot of people off. And but I think one of the challenges for the industry is going to be how that gets dealt with, because if it doesn't get dealt with, then I think you've got a lot of people that are on one side saying that they're very environmentally conscious, doing something that's got a fairly adverse impact on the environment, kind of going, okay, well, how do you weigh that up?
Absolutely. No, 100%. I mean, it's interesting subjects it's an interesting topic that really, like I said, is at the forefront of innovation right now. And there's a lot of stuff coming out of it, out of the whole cryptocurrency, space in general. You have other, different, blockchain-based initiatives, Cardano, ADA, and stuff like that are being much more, environmentally friendly. That has a much lower footprint. Like, how are those going to adapt into the NFT space? Like, what is that going to look like? And we're a lot of these questions we don't have answers to just yet, but I think people like Kath and a lot of the other people that are running those Clubhouse, conversations, we should openly talk about that and discuss those ramifications.
I think it's very disingenuous not to be talking about it.
Yeah.
I mean, I was in a space where I think Michael Shaneblum was in there as well, and there were quite a few other bigger names in that space, and one of the topics that came up was taxation. And I think the lack of understanding about that within the community in particular, because the tax offices around the world, the IRS in the US and the ATO over here, and I know in New Zealand they're doing it in Europe and the UK, they're all onto it, and they're saying, well, that's income.
Oh yeah.
And
we want our percent.
That's exactly right. Yeah. There's two things that are absolutely certain in life, and that's death and taxes.
Death and taxes. 100% agree, for sure. I agree. A lot of people don't understand that. You're 100% right.
Yeah, and it was interesting because I did a quick Google search and found both the IRS, because it was mostly American in the space. I found an IRS commentary on it, and also a Time article about how it gets handled, which is more the layman's term, because the IRS one was typical legalese,
Yeah, I was about to say it's lawyer speak for sure.
That's right. Not something that artists are going to sit there and pore over and read and understand.
Definitely not.
They're going to hand it off to their lawyer and say, interpret that for me. Exactly. But the interpretation is going to be, well, you owe some money to Uncle Sam if in the US, or the treasurer here.
Yep. Agreed.
No, I think it's a fascinating space to look into, and I think one of the important things is that the creative people that are in that community, I think, are probably in the box seat to try and solve some of those problems as well. Not necessarily all of the technical issues around how the cryptocurrencies themselves actually burn fossil fuels, but certainly looking for creative and clever ways of countering the environmental impact and other impacts that it may have.
Definitely agree, 100%. No, it's good conversations to have for sure. I'm excited to see exactly where it goes. I, like you, have dabbled, but not done a ton just yet. And I'm interested to see, like I said, where that conversation goes, because I think it's going to be fascinating. And I think you're right. There's a lot of benefits. There's a lot of negatives. And at the end of the day, things are going to happen regardless. So I think we have to figure out what that middle ground looks like. And hopefully advances in technology and cryptocurrency, initiatives mixed in with, artists pushing things, especially in the NFT space, digital artists all over the world, I think all need to help come together and collaborate. Just as you're saying, we have this collaborative effort. We have an opportunity. Hopefully we can start that process and it goes into a positive space.
Totally. Well, I got one more question, and for me, it's definitely the most important one. Do you like pineapple on pizza?
I actually do like pineapple on pizza. It's not my favorite, but I like pineapple in general. I think it's one of those things where if I walked into a room and I was hungry and there was pineapple on pizza, I'd eat it and not complain about it because I think it's good.
But
if I'm going to a pizza place, I probably wouldn't order it. I'm a little bit more, I'm the guy that typically gets like the meat lovers pizza, right? Like that's my happy place. Like give me some sauteed mushrooms and onions mixed in with some, bacon and ham and sausage. I'm a happy guy. But yeah, I wouldn't complain about it if it was the only pizza in the room.
All right. Well, thanks so much for talking to me, Colby. This has been an absolute joy to talk to you today. Where can people find your work?
Yeah, well, first off, thank you for having me again. I really appreciate conversations like this, and you were a consummate host, so I appreciate that. For me, any of you guys that are listening, you can go to colbybrownphotography.com, which is, obviously my space in the internet world. Tons of information, education, stuff there on workshops. And of course, anything in social media, Instagram, colbybrownphotography.com. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook. You just Google and you'll be able to find you probably can't not find me, which is more of a problematic than anything else. But yeah, love to hear from you guys.
Fantastic. All right. Thanks, Colby.
My pleasure.
Thanks again for listening to Landscape Photography World. I hope you enjoyed the show, and keep listening because I'll be joined with some great guests in upcoming episodes. You can find my work in this podcast at grantswinburnephotography.com. I'm also on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. I'm Grant Swinburne and hope to see you out shooting soon.